Well, first off, just a little bit of biographical information. You're a graduate of Lipscomb in the 50s, and you said earlier that you were one of the first. You were the first class that was accredited with graduating from. You go ahead and.
If memory serves. Memory serves, I believe that my graduating class in 1955 was the first one that graduated after final approval for Lipscomb by the Southern colleges or whatever that unit was that accredited universities, colleges and universities. And it was no big deal, but it showed the advancement of the school and what they were trying to do.
And what year was that?
1955.
Okay. And now you were telling me that you actually started your journalism career really, really young.
Yeah, I was a student here at Lipscomb, a sophomore. My father died, and I needed money for tuition and food and gasoline, and my mother couldn't help me with that. And so I tried to find nighttime jobs and was fortunate enough to get on with the Tennessean, which of course as a morning newspaper would publish, with the work hours were like 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 1 or 2 in the morning. So while it wreaked havoc with my grades and homework, it was good hours to work full time while I was a full-time student. I wound up, they told me that I was on a 90-day trial, and I wound up working 45 years. I never had another job.
I'd say that's a pretty good run. But you also said that you just started off in sports. You were covering high school sports, right?
Right. That was the job they had at the newspaper, the prep editor. And in those days, high schools were big. They took 2 or 3 people to cover them with the space we provided to publicize games and results and so forth. And there wasn't a lot of media in those days, and there was great interest in high school sports.
Do you think part of that reason is because the college game wasn't built up to this big pageantry thing, and
no, it was more like it was a community thing. You know, it's. I look back now, and I covered people who I later covered their son. It was, and generations would come up, and you know, the games. They were neighborhood schools. No need to go into why that would be good or bad, but the point was they were neighborhood schools, and families saw their children and grandchildren grow up and play at the same school in the neighborhood, and it was just a popular thing. It was a great thing to do on Friday nights for football, and then lesser crowds a couple of times a week for basketball, and that's the job they had opening. And that's how I got started. I did some work outside sports. I edited the Robertson County Times in Springfield for 20 years as a part-time job and put my children through college with that money. I also had worked in news while I was in the Army as a draftee.
And you got drafted right after you graduated, right?
Yeah, a few months after. I had been deferred 3 times for keeping my grades up here at Lipscomb and earning a degree or making progress towards a degree. And they never took my name off the top of that list. So when I graduated, it wasn't very long before I was inducted into the Army in the draft. It was right at the end of the Korean War. And
you mentioned that your bio kind of says that you were the editor of the newspaper at your base, right?
Yeah, it's called Reveille. I can never forget it. Yeah, I was editor of the base paper. I also did some ghostwriting for the commanding general of the Post that had to do with the new training things that were more of information gathering than actually writing, but it was fun. Nevertheless, I had the cushiest job on Post.
And that was in Arkansas, right?
Yes, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, just outside Fort Smith.
And then you came right back to your job at the Tennessean?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in those days, the government made your former employee take you back if you'd been drafted. Mm-hmm. So whether they wanted me or not, they got me when I came back.
Now, I know you played baseball. Did you play anything else growing up? I mean, or were
Yeah,
you...
I was on the high school basketball team.
Okay.
And played in sandlot leagues, baseball. Was the ball boy and worked the scoreboard at the old baseball park in Nashville, Sulphurdale, as a kid. And because I lived in North Nashville and the ballpark was sort of in North Nashville, it was sort of a neighborhood job. I could walk down and walk back.
Just like you walked to school, right?
Yeah, yeah, in the snow.
Now, you started covering high school sports, and one of the things that we talked about earlier was you were covering people that you also went to school with because you were so young. You were a sophomore. Was that a little weird? Was that a little different? I mean,
well, it was okay because I wasn't writing anything very important, just the scores of the game and who did what and at what time. So it wasn't. Pressures would come later on when I had other assignments where people's lives were changed somewhat, and with what you were writing and what you were investigating and find out. But I didn't do a lot of that to Tennessean because most of my work there was in sports. Mm-hmm. Say virtually all of it, actually.
Once you, moved on, or not moved on, but what else did you cover, like getting through year after year? You did high school and then...
Well, I did high schools, and then I did Vanderbilt beat writer for about 20 years. And then for a number of years I was out of writing, and I was the deputy sports editor, and which meant that I sort of ran the office and made assignments for coverage and things like that. And then about 4 years before my retirement in 1998, that seems like a long time now, but it's gone by very quickly. But I was a senior writer, and I just looked up my own stories and developed them and wrote big features and stuff, sort of with them not paying all that much attention to me until I had something to turn in.
I just have talking points here. It's one of the things you did, it says you were the author of a child's first sports book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I wrote a book about Chuck Ross. Do you know who he is?
I do know Chuck. I'm very
believe it or not,
Chuck.
I wrote a book about Chuck Ross. And for folks who don't know, Chuck is a mentally challenged kid who grew up in East Nashville, and it was a wonderful fan of Lipscomb. Still is. I saw him not so long ago. Mm-hmm. Still is. And Barry Brewer at 21st Century Christian Publishing wanted a book for Chuck to sort of a fundraiser for him, I think, to help him along after his mother passed away. And so Barry asked me if I would do it, and it scared me to death to think of what I would write, because it's so sensitive when you write about a mentally challenged person or a physically challenged person, that you have to be so careful with what you say and how you portray things, particularly humor. And so I wrote a book about Chuck Ross called Beat 'em and Beat 'em Bad. Coach Don Meyer, who was at Lipscomb for so many years, used to let Chuck occasionally get in the locker room and give a speech, a pregame speech, and that was always his theme: beat 'em and beat 'em bad. And so that was the name of the book.
I just want to share this story with you. I was talking to Coach Meyer last time he was here when they named the basketball court after him not too long ago, and I was asking him about Chuck, and one of the stories that he told me is they were going home one night and Coach Meyer had dozed off and kind of ran off the road and he blew a tire, and Chuck was with him, and so Coach Meyer, he said he wasn't in the best part of town, and so he was trying to hurry and get the tire changed, and he was jacking up the car. And he couldn't get the car jacked up, and he just kept trying and couldn't do it. Well, he turned and looked. It was the back rear tire on his side, and he stood up and looked, and Chuck was sitting on the hood of the car, and he couldn't get it jacked up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've heard several stories of Chuck, and I've seen him here the past 4 years that I've been here. So
yeah, Chuck. The book, of course, had a lot of those kinds of stories. Chuck, he called me one night. He had a habit of calling at all hours of the night, and he called me one time real late, like 1 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "What time is the Tennessee football team arriving tomorrow afternoon at the airport?" Chuck would always go meet the visiting team. In those days, there's just one airport, and the charters would empty right there and come through the airport. And Chuck was always there to greet him. And I said, "Chuck, I don't have any idea. We never covered the arrival of a team the day before a game." At any rate, the phone hangs up. It's not 10 minutes later that it's Chuck. He's calling. And he says, "Jimmy," he says, "the Tennessee coach says they'll be in about 1:30. And hangs up, which meant that at 4 o'clock in the morning, he had called the Tennessee football coach and asked him what time the team was going to be at the airport. But
from what I understand, that's not the only time he talked to a coach. Coach Meyer was also telling me a story about one time that he called off one of Coach Dugan's baseball games.
Yes, he called off baseball games.
So he could go watch high school basketball.
Well, it was sort of more than that. It had been raining, and Chuck was convinced that it was going to rain out the game. And the coach calls at Lipscomb, and Chuck, I don't know how he got in touch with the coach, but he told the coach, says, "No, there'll be no game this afternoon. It's raining hard here. There'll be no game." And Dugan has his team all warmed up to play, and no team ever shows up. And he makes a call. I believe it was to Oakland team, Michigan, and gets a coach and said, "Where are you guys?" Said, "Well, we're just on our way home because one of your coaches said the game had been called off." So Chuck notoriously had called off a doubleheader on a team traveling north.
Can that book still be purchased?
No, it was just one printing, and we had a dinner here for Chuck at Lipscomb, and part of the price of a seat or a table was you got an autographed book. I've autographed it, and Chuck autographed it. And they used all they printed and kept some around at 21st Century for a while. And eventually, I may have the only few copies still left, and it'd be less than 10. Mm-hmm. So no, they're a keepsake.
One of the things that I found interesting was that I had talked with Joe Biddle a few weeks ago, and he was at the Banner and then went to the Tennessean. And you were always at the Tennessean, but you were also really good friends with the people that you competed with at the Banner. Can you talk about maybe a few of those guys? Edgar Allen was one that I found, and just talk about that just a little bit.
It was back in the day, and I'm talking now about 50s, 60s, 70s, in the range. There was, of course, great animosity between the two newspapers in town. The Nashville Banner, which was the afternoon paper, and the Tennessean, which of course was the morning paper and still is. And they were privately owned. The Stallman family owned the Banner, and well, I can't think of who owned the Tennessean. But anyway, Evans, the Evans family, Silliman Evans Sr. and his son Silliman Jr., and Amon, the younger son, became friends of all of us in the sports department. But in those days, there was really hard feelings between the newsrooms, the people who dealt with politics, and the Banner was conservative and the Tennessean was considered liberal, and was in the eye of the beholder. But there was some animosity there. There wasn't any friendships there. But in the sports department, there was a great competition. You didn't want to lose a story. You had to explain why you did lose a story to the other people, because this is before TV announced all the news at night. You know, news popped up in the morning when we had a story. And yes, we sometimes traveled together. John Bibb, who later became a sports editor when he was a golf writer, made a lot of trips with Waxo Green, and they were very close family. Waxo was a long-time Banner reporter. And of course, my competition, there was a lot of people, but I was expected to get stories, but I also, a guy like Edgar Allan became a great friend of mine, and he was a wonderful newsman. And I remember one time Edgar and I covering a golf tournament in Memphis, and I go over to his room at the hotel and see if he's ready to go to the golf course. I was going to ride with him. And I knock on the door and he says, "Come in," but he can't get out of bed. He had this terrible swimming in his head. He had inner ear problems, and he couldn't get out of bed. And so he gave me his car keys, and that's when I discovered that the Volkswagen Bug he had did not have reverse. So you had to be very careful where you parked, because you had no reverse. You had to park on the corner. But an example of cooperation between us in those days was the fact that he never was able to get out of the bed, and I covered the story both for the Banner and the Tennessean without anybody knowing for the next 2 or 3 days. And I had occasion covering Vanderbilt when you used to make arrangements to send your story by the Western Union, if you can believe it. And they would print out a sheet. They didn't send a telegram, but they just on a machine. And sometimes they forgot to come out. Western Union did. If the guy that had to come out thought he'd worked too many hours that day, he might not show up at the game. And many times, and one time in particular at LSU, I would type my story normally on just a regular typewriter and hand it to the lady or the gentleman who was from Western Union, and they would retype it in and send it story. With them not there, Waxo read my story, dictated my story. I handed it to him, and he dictated my story to the Tennessean. Those were the kinds of things that, that got a little bit above the normal relationship with your competitors. But it didn't lessen the pressure to always beat your buddy and beat him bad, as the book said.
Let's move on to, well, you talked about, one of the things I like to ask people is, give me an example of when things didn't really go as planned, and you talk about that with Western Union maybe not showing up. Is there any other instance where you can think of that, I mean, something just did not go as planned and you had to scramble for what you were going to do or what you were going to give the paper?
Yeah. It's hard to come up with something just immediately, but one time again at LSU, the old Parker Agricultural Center was where they played. It had a dirt floor, and they put down the gym floor, a temporary gym floor, for the games, for the LSU games. They played Vanderbilt. Well, it poured rain that day, poured rain, and so much so they couldn't keep the water off the playing floor. The roof leaked at the old Parker Ag Center. And so the rain is pouring in. And we wind up going to Baton Rouge Catholic High School to play the Vanderbilt LSU men's basketball game. And so at the end of the game, I had nothing. My phones and my typewriter and everything was all over at Parker Ag Center drying out. And I had to dictate my story on a payphone on the wall of Baton Rouge Catholic High School. And as I'm calling it in, I grew an audience. They knew what I was doing, and so all these LSU fans are gathering behind me, and I would say something, they would cheer, or I would dictate another paragraph of something that happened in the game, and they would boo and let me know I had said the wrong word. And it was like being harassed from the audience. I've grown to think that comedians who get booed off the stage, I understand their problems.
Was that maybe the beginning of a radio career is what it sounds like to me. Did you ever do radio?
Yes. I was 2 years, I think, total. I was on the Teddy Bart Roundtable show in the morning, which was a very popular talk show. He's an icon in the radio business in Nashville and this area. And I was on there as a successor to John Bibb, who had been on there for years, going all the way back to when the show was put on channel by WSM out off White Bridge Road. And then on TV, not on a regular basis, but was a good friend of Hope Hines, a really fine TV newsman who recently retired from Channel 5. And he had a show on their Plus channel from 8 to 9 at night. And he would call me and say, "Jimmy, what are you doing?" And I knew then that one of his guests had died. One of his guests had been struck with an illness. Well, his guest had had a car wreck, or something horrendous had happened to him that they weren't going to show up. So I got to be a regular emergency sub on the program, and half the time didn't know what the subject was going to be till I got there. I'm not sure what that says about my gift of gab, but
I think it may say a little something. You're doing pretty well right now, so I'm not going to complain one bit. One thing that I found really interesting on you, and I'd love for you to talk about some more, is about the Skywriters.
Skywriters.
Yeah. I don't know much, so
Skywriters. There's not much you can say about the Skywriters without being sued for slander, even though it would all be true. There were a lot of people who took the opportunity to party on that week that we visited all these campuses. But the Skywriters, they no longer have it, but the SEC, the Southeastern Conference, would charter a plane, and you paid so much to get a seat on the plane, and reservations were made to go to every campus of every Southeastern Conference football school. All of them were football schools, but during football season, in the preseason. And a whole lot, there's a guy from Florida, Jack Harston. I'm not sure if Jack's still with us, but he was from the Jacksonville paper, and he would sit in the back with the microphone and on the Southern Airways plane would describe all the great air crashes that had taken place in history. So a dirigible went down in East Germany, or some Russian airplane had been lost in the Arctic, or he had all kinds of stories about disasters involving airplanes. And we were on this old Southern plane. You can imagine what kind of plane we got. Every once in a while you get on one that'd have a little tag on it that said, "This plane is the property of so-and-so that is in bankruptcy." And so you figured maintenance wasn't great on some of these Skyrider teams. But one time, one of our members passed out at dinner, and I won't say he passed out because of partying, but at any rate, he fainted. And right at the end of the meal, and so didn't know what to do with him. It was hard to get him revived, and nobody had any water or had things. So there was a table there where they had the buffet, and it had been cleaned except for this one great big bowl of cucumbers in water. And so somebody says, "Well, let's don't let him just lean over here on the table. Let's take and put him on this table." And they lifted him up and put him on this table and moved the cucumbers down to the other end of the table. And somebody says, "Do we have a cold rag or something?" And they said, "No, but we have cucumbers." And they put cucumbers all over this guy's face and head and eyes. And they were on there when the doctor arrived. And when he looks down at this guy laying there on the buffet table with all these cucumbers on his face, he said, "Where's the witch doctor?"
I'd say that's a fairly interesting story about the Skyriders. I'll see if I can't find more about that though.
The Skyriders also had access to players, and they would say controversial things, and the coaches didn't particularly like the Skyriders, but I always enjoyed it. Always enjoyed to be able to see these people, not just call them on the phone, and you find out, you know, what they're really like. Later on, they picked out guys who wouldn't say anything, so it became meaningless, and thus the whole program died.
And that was when you were covering football at Vandy.
Yeah.
And you did basketball at Vandy, right?
I did all the sports.
Okay.
In those days, one person did all. You had some help. You had here and there, but by and large, you were responsible for all the sports. And
one of the things that I've always wondered about, and Joe Biddle talked about this, and I know Mark McGee has talked to me about it. During the 80s, there was a big steroid thing at Vandy. Yeah. And you did probably a lot more work than I realized with that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I worked with John Bibb on that. It was illegal steroids being found and being sent from the Vanderbilt weight room. And a track athlete at Clemson had died and had steroids. You know, these are prescription steroids, but there were no prescription. And so the investigation led to Vanderbilt's dressing room. And to make a long story short, John Bibb and I had almost daily stories for 8 or 9 months on developments that surrounded this. And we won Best of Gannett, which is 82 newspapers for investigative reporting on that illegal steroid investigation. And we also had our work submitted to the Pulitzer Committee. Somehow in my mind, I think they may have read it. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but obviously they didn't award any prize. But we were pretty happy that it it was deemed worthy of submitting. And it was fun to do, and it was hard to do, and you made enemies that you had friendships with, and I think looking back, it was the most bittersweet thing that I ever did, as far as breaking news and investigative reporting, and it was so good to be able to do that, because our boss at that time was John Sigenthaler. And on similar stories like this that break, other newspapers had routinely taken the story away from the sports departments and given them to news guys that investigated for a living, not just something that popped up. But he allowed John Bibb and myself and Kurt Loggins was a court reporter at that time, and Kurt was a great newsman too at the Tennessean, and there may have been a few others, but by and large, Bibb and I wrote the stories and did the investigative work. I found the source of the steroids. I wouldn't like to go into that because the guy has served his time and gotten his license back and gotten his life back, and he actually thought he was doing some good with the program at the time. But that's like I say, a bittersweet moment, probably my best moment, and yet probably the most difficult emotionally. Didn't hurt that it didn't help either that during that time my son, who was a student at Lipscomb, had cancer and eventually passed away in 1984, right as this was all going on, which again made it even doubly more difficult.
One of the things that sticks out to me is you were probably, I assume that you were so immersed into the program at that point that it was almost easy to talk to people, but it was also very difficult to get what you needed.
No, people get afraid and they just turn. People you think are friends are no longer friends when you show up looking for something to splash across the newspaper. And it was because of that shortly after there was 52 unindicted co-conspirators in the case, as it turns out. And as soon as those rulings came down, I never covered Vanderbilt as a beat writer for about the next 10 years, from about 84 to 94. And then the last 4 years I covered Vanderbilt basketball. Jan Van Bredekoff was the coach, and I had covered him, by the way, in the 70s as Vanderbilt's most valuable player. I had been there long enough that he's now the head coach that I'm covering. And he too didn't give me much help.
Now, I understand you spent most of your time doing Vandy things, but during your time while you were covering Vandy, we here at Lipscomb had, one of the best basketball teams in the country. Definitely as far as, obviously we won the NAI championship in the 80s. Did you do anything with Coach Meyer and his team?
I was a fan.
Okay.
That's what I was.
Okay, can you just talk about your experiences as a fan then?
That's right. Well, there's just nothing quite like it. The old gym.
McQuitty?
Yeah, it was packed. When I went to school here, it was a cheap date. You got in free, and students couldn't, they'd stand in line to get in the gym. I can't believe these days when none of them show up. It still perplexes me, because in my day, and not just as a student, but later as an adult, they packed that place. You're talking about excitement. And of course, Meyer was crazy on the sidelines. He'd kick chairs and he'd run.
I always remember him.
Yeah.
See videos and
Right.
loosening his tie.
Oh yeah, he loosened his tie. But those were fun days, but I didn't cover them. We covered them real well though during that period of time. as I recall, and Lipscomb, we not only covered the basketball, but we covered baseball. They had a great baseball program.
Also won a national championship.
Yes, they did, and should have won more. You get beat in baseball. You have a bad day and you get beat. But yes, Lipscomb athletics was at its zenith in those days. They were good in everything.
Is that how you? I mean, obviously you had kids going here. You went here. Did your and you
My
were a
wife
fan?
went here.
Yeah, your wife went here
And one son.
Yes. Is that how you got to know Chuck? Was through them? I don't know how old Chuck is, but I don't know how long he's been Lipscomb's biggest sports fan.
He's really old. I know Chuck. When the first time I saw Chuck, early in my career, wow, Edgar Allen, we talked about him before, and I would score and time the Middle Tennessee middle school basketball tournaments at the end of the season. And they would play all day long at the gym. They start about 7 in the morning. They play one game right after another to midnight. And it was during one of these tournaments at the old Isaac Litton gym. It's no longer a high school. It's a junior high, I think, out off Gallatin Road. But it had sort of a walking track around the top of it, is my best memory. Anyway, there was seats on top of the bleachers. There was this that came out. And at some point in time one Saturday, all that plaster and metal swung down and almost hit everybody. Just barely missed everybody's head. It just comes swinging down. And of course they stop everything. And I'm a newsman and I can see that this is beyond sports. This was dangerous. Somebody could have been hurt. So I rush out into the hallway and there's this chubby little fat guy making call after call after call and not giving me access to the only phone. It was Chuck as a little kid. He had found out that radio stations in those days would give $5 if you called in a news story. And if it's good enough, they might give you 10. And Chuck was running up the cash register with the phone in the hallway.
Wow.
And I had to go all the way into the school to make a call. No one had a cell phone. But Chuck, even as a small kid, he was reporting the news. And that was the beginning of his long relationship with the news media in Nashville.
That's pretty incredible. Now let's go. Did you, staying on Lipscomb, did you do anything with the Lipscomb-Belmont game that they had at Memorial since you did Vanderbilt stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I covered that game.
Okay, yeah, 1990. Yeah, 1990.
Yeah, John Pierce was playing for Lipscomb, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Philip Hutchinson, I think he had already gone. I think this was...
I think
was this John Pierce?
Yeah, we won the championship in '89, and Phil Hutch graduated. He graduated that year, so it would have been
John Pierce, I believe. And John Pierce beat Tennessee State. They played Tennessee State at Vanderbilt.
I didn't know that.
Yes, they beat them. And Lipscomb had a really good team. About like the Belmont team is now. Much better than people, because of the name, they didn't think they were all that good.
Very balanced.
Yeah, very balanced, good. Really always had a really big scorer. Meyer always had the offense so that somebody was scoring every point. And those were big games. Yeah, it's big time.
And now talk about a little bit how this came later in your career, really near the end of it when you retired in 98, 99.
98.
Pro sports maybe coming into town and what that's done to media here as far as covering colleges and the high schools?
Well, you know, newspapers, they make money on how they handle space. Space is money. You know, they say, why don't you add a page? Well, if you add a page, you have to add 4 pages sometimes. And if you add 4 and your circulation is 250,000, you're talking about 1 million sheets of paper. And don't hold me to these economics, because, but there's just so much room in the newspaper and just so many people you're going to hire to cover the events. And when pro teams like the hockey team, and particularly like the Titans, when they come into town, and it's been duplicated all over the country. Atlanta was that way. Anytime they arrive, it's like one of those old popsicles you used to punch out, you know, out the top and heat them off and punch them up again. When the Titans and the other pro teams, when they start getting more of the space, somebody gets less of it. And in that case, sometimes it's the high schools, sometimes it's the local and area colleges, and most of the time it's sort of a combination of the two, that the amount of space they're allotted by who's ever in charge just goes down because the Titans and the Predators dominate the news so much. I always thought that, and I think that was a general feeling in Nashville, that the first pro team was going to be a baseball team. And Larry Schmittou was working towards that end. He started the Sounds back up in '78, I believe. Don't hold me to that year, but that's what pops into my mind. And there were times when he would make an attempt to move towards getting a baseball team for Nashville. I don't think we were ever large enough to handle that kind of a team, but be that as it may, as it turns out, his efforts suffered when these teams came in too, because the professional baseball team fell right into that group that wasn't going to get as much space as they once enjoyed in the newspaper, and they weren't going to get as many minutes on TV either as before, or minutes on the radio, because that's just the nature of the beast. When you get a National Football League team in your town, I don't care what size it is, even New York City, they're going to dominate the news space.
Now let's go to a little bit of general kind of sort of lighthearted things to finish up here. I like to ask people that I talk to, especially sports reporters, this. Something that I think any sports reporter will tell you is that one of the perks is maybe, sometimes it's a perk, sometimes it's not, is the food that you may be served on press row at a game. I know it's going to be different everywhere you go, but I asked Joe this, and I've asked a few other people this. The best press row food that you can remember?
Oh, the best press row food. I would have to say that it was in Louisiana, LSU, I think, because I like Cajun food. They always had shrimp, and they always had the stuff I like to eat. But it was okay, whatever it was. You know, it's free. If you didn't like it, eat before you go. I never did understand why they were obligated to feed the press, but it had been a tradition, and so I guess it just continued. But I know that probably the worst was Kentucky basketball when C.M. Newton went there and served popcorn and Coke.
Yeah, you can get that pretty much anywhere.
That had to go along with maybe the worst.
Now, maybe let's see. Let's do best view at from press row, whether it be football, basketball, baseball, whatever.
Best room for, press is always courtside basketball.
How is it on that? How is it different from Vanderbilt and maybe covering at UT's arena? I mean, it's obviously very
It's much different.
Yeah.
And it was really different in my day. If you know the configuration inside Memorial Gym, the press box was the last tier up in the ceiling. I mean, in the ceiling. It was, you looked down and it was like looking at a coaching film. You couldn't tell how tall anybody was. They put a plaque up there with my name on seat 25, which is where I sat for all those years. I don't know if it's still up there or not. Someday I'm gonna go up there and look. But before I get too old to climb all those stairs. But it was a joy to go on the road, because when you went on the road, all of a sudden, you were right into the action. I mean, you're right on the front row. You see what everybody looked like. You could tell how tall they were. You could hear everything they said to each other or to the official. And the joy of covering was always the proximity from the action.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that basketball was your favorite sport to cover because of that?
Well, it just depends. I think football was probably my favorite sport to cover, because there was so much to be said about a football game. But for the sheer enjoyment of covering, basketball was so good, because if you lost Tuesday, you had another game Saturday. Football, if you lost, you had another week to fill with stories where you had to kind of keep interest in the team while they weren't playing anything. They weren't doing anything. They were still sitting on that loss or win or whatever it was.
It sounds like you've done a lot of traditional sports covering as far as baseball, basketball, football. Is there anything maybe off the beaten path, so to speak, that you've done? Covered?
Yeah, I covered ice skating.
Ice skating?
Yes, they had the ice skating nationals or some age group down at the GEC downtown in Nashville. And I was assigned ice dancing. And so all I knew was that they jiggled around all over the place, and they had to keep their feet going at the same time. And there was this pair from Huntsville, Alabama, of all places, to think about ice skating, although they do have a tradition, and they have a college ice skating team, and they have an ice rink. But they were marvelous. They didn't miss. I knew if you fell, that wasn't good. That's all I knew, that if you fell, that's not good. Well, they had this pair from California, the real surfer look. The guy had his hair blonde, and the beautiful girl that was with him, and they must have fallen a half dozen times. They had the worst experience of their lives. Guess who won the meet?
Probably the California people.
California. And you know what? I was in the press room, and I said, how can this be? And of course, they recognized me as a country bumpkin in this sport. How could I know? And so, but it seemed to me logical that if you fell down a lot, you shouldn't win. Mm-hmm. And so the only explanation I ever got was, well, they're the #1 team in the country. They're the best team, so they won. And they win, they did. That's the most unusual experience. And the only experience, by the way, because I was so confrontational, I didn't get assigned there the next night to cover anything.
Wow, that's pretty impressive, actually. I'm glad you took a stand, though. Glad you stood up for what you believed in. Yeah, I'm glad you stood up for what you believed in. I have on here, ask about golf. Did you cover golf?
I was a golf writer for years.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Went to 9 Masters golf tournaments. My favorite event.
Yeah, so you just love Augusta, and it's just
Oh, it's great. And generally, you were just back from somewhere up north covering the Final Four, at
and you covered those as
March
well.
Madness. Yeah, oh, yeah, I covered any number of Final Fours. Uh, but yeah, golf and the Masters tournaments. As a matter of fact, I had decided to retire. March 8th is my birthday, which is not too long from while we're filming here. And so I said that I was going to retire on my birthday when I was 65. But it was in March, and I got to thinking, if I retire just 1 month later, I'll get to go to the Masters again. And so I retired a month later so I could make my last trip to the Masters. And great trips. I got to see Tiger Woods as an amateur and got to see him when he was really bad and young and inexperienced and frustrated. And then I got to see him play the greatest round that's ever been played there. I think he won by 12 shots or something. And you could see the greatness. You didn't have to have a trained eye to see that he was going to be great.
Any other obviously that's probably your favorite course since it's your favorite event to cover. Another one that sticks out to you?
Golf course? I think I was at Oakmont in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just a few years ago, and had been there before, and it was a wonderful, tough golf course.
I was gonna say,
so hard. It's just so difficult you can't imagine. Because when you walk off the fairway, many times you're walking through grass up to your knees. And you get to thinking about, man, if I played this golf course, I'd have to buy 100 balls. I wouldn't be able to make it to the clubhouse.
And we'll end on this little stuff right here. You've won numerous things. You've talked about the Best of Gannett because of the steroid scandal that was at Vandy. Sports Writer of the Year in '77, and you won the Avalon Award from here.
Yes.
And I'm familiar with that one.
Creative excellence. I don't know how I won that.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, as a writer, I mean, you wrote for 45 years. I'm sure you were very, very creative in your art. And then you have an award named after you.
At the Tennessean.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's sort of in limbo at this time.
Okay.
But for many years, for several years, I won't say many, but for 10 years or so, it carried a $2,500 prize for the winner as sort of the MVP of the newsroom for the year, and was quite popular. And that was one of the gifts they gave me as a retirement present.
And is there any sort of advice or something that you want to leave somebody who may be interested in journalism at any point?
Well, I think that if to be interested in journalism requires a lot of thought these days. Journalists have always been at the lower end of the pay scale for the hours that's going to be necessary for you to be good. And I've taught class over here a couple of times for freshman English, just one day when they were studying writing. And my advice is always if you want to do this, you have to work hard at it. And you have to build your own style. You can't be somebody else. If you're a funny guy, you're going to write funny things. And if you're dead serious, you're going to write dead serious things because that's your mentality. But don't let that bother you. Just develop that and become what you can become. I don't know. None of my children went into journalism. They saw how much I was away from home and travel and so forth, and the pay is better these days, but I don't think pay, you have to get along and you have to make a nice nest for yourself and your family and be sure that you have fun and money's not a distraction. But basically, you have to really enjoy going to work if you're going to be a journalist.